Hi and welcome to the Discourse Collective. Today's video is about COVID and COVID vaccines. Now there are a few more divisive subjects today than vaccines, and COVID specifically has brought that conversation right to the fore. The questions around mandatory vaccines are keeping it there as well. Now this isn't a medically based video. I'm not a doctor, but I will be looking at some of the latest medical thinking on vaccines in general and COVID in particular. Now, whatever you feel about the subject, this video isn't designed to make you feel bad. I'm not going to shout at you or try to make out that your decision is wrong. The opposite, actually. In fact, your situation is unique to you, and I just want to give you some space to think about the whole thing from a range of perspectives, which is what this channel's all about, really. Now, this isn't about who's right or who's wrong, it's about overall best outcomes. That being said, if you are doubtful that the COVID vaccine exists, or you think that vaccines are some kind of plot to control the population, this video won't be for you. This video is predicated on the mainstream narrative being broadly true. Now, we're going to be looking at a little vaccine history, the factors that make people accept or refuse a vaccine, and why it's not all about hard data and statistics. It's fair to say that vaccines have always caused a societal division. If you feel distrustful of them, then you join a very long line of people stretching back to the very first vaccine for smallpox. It's perfectly normal to feel nervous about an invasive medical procedure. That could be physical or pharmacological. Now, as Edward Jenner began vaccinating people with his vaccine from the pus of other infected people, many people from the religious, scientific and general communities began to object. Many religious people thought that using material from animals or humans was against God's will. Some scientists at the time felt Jenner's research was flawed or had gone in the wrong direction. Many parents were reluctant to allow their children to be experimented on by Jenner, and that's what it was. It was at that point an experiment. Now, as vaccines were introduced, the Vaccination Act of 1853 in the UK that made vaccines mandatory, the opposition became more and more vocal. Rallies were held and the public mood turned very much against vaccination. Drawings and cartoons, a popular format of social commentary at that time, were particularly scathing of vaccination. Many fanned those fears of short-term or adverse effects and long-term social damage if that programme continued. Now, if that sounds familiar, it's because it is. The backgrounds of the pro-vaccines and anti-vaccine arguments haven't really shifted. What has shifted, as we'll see, is where those arguments are taking place. Now, this is a modern take on an old problem. The current social feeling on vaccines has drawn a red line, largely along scientific lines. Those in favour point to the strong evidence of safety and effectiveness, while those against point at corporate greed, flawed science, government incompetence and cover-ups. Now, in the 70s and 80s, various doctors and researchers began to express their concern about vaccine safety. Gordon Stewart and Alan Wakefield are names you may have heard of. Those doctors with the diphtheria, tetanus, DDP, and the measles, mumps and rubella MMR vaccine, respectively, made their names claiming that those vaccines were unsafe. Wakefield in particular has created a wave of distrust that has lasted up until the present day and continues to fuel anti-vaccine debates. As the COVID debate continues to dominate the news, there are two main ways of thinking that seem to be emerging, more or less. The commonly held narrative. Now, in a nutshell, the narrative that's most often presented is that the virus came from China, from animal to human cross-infection, first spreading around China and Asia, then the rest of the world's rapid transit systems using planes and trains. As world governments tried to gather data to form a strategy for this unknown virus, it became apparent that some people catching the virus needed hospital care, often displaying respiratory distress. Now, in most countries, there was initially a great deal of panic. Some countries bought measures such as masks wearing and travel bans. Since those early days, countries have been fighting a kind of pitched battle involving kind of introducing and then removing various measures to try to curb the virus, and there's been mixed success. This commonly held narrative has been challenged from multiple angles in almost every possible way you can imagine. From Donald Trump advising people to take unproven medication to mass street protests against mask mandates. But before we get into that, we need to talk about postmodernism. If you're wondering why I'm sitting in a darkened room with an ice pack on my head, it's because postmodernism. Every time I try to get my head around this subject, it comes back to bite me in the arse. I don't know what it is. It's my personal bugbear. It's just my nemesis when it comes to this kind of thing. Without dragging you down the rabbit hole, let me try to explain why it's relevant to the discussion on COVID vaccines. Now, postmodernism was a reaction against modernism in itself, which again came from Romanticism and then Enlightenment further down the line. It was a reaction against the scientific way of thinking, data, dogma, ideology. It was a way of looking at the universe that it was completely subjective. It discounts things like churches and political institutions and fact and logic and reason and replaces them with, ultimately, subjectivity. Now, if you look at what's happening with COVID vaccines today, that's a lot of what's happening. People don't want to be dragged into collectivist arguments about why COVID should be dealt with in certain ways. Rather, they want to look at it completely subjectively from their own lens, their own perspective, using their own thoughts and their own feelings about COVID. And that is why postmodernism is so relevant to this discussion, and it's a theme you're going to see in this video over and over again. Watch out perhaps for a video in the future on postmodernism if I can get rid of this headache. Now, with that out of the way, let's talk about hesitancy versus anti-vaxxers. In a polarised world where we live, the media would love you to think that there are only two groups when it comes to vaccines. Huge pro-vaccine people and total anti-vaxxers. Now, like many of today's big discussion points, this kind of hard polarisation is not helpful. In reality, there's a wide body of people who hold a range of ideas and opinions that span a big chasm from vaccines are safe and should be mandatory, right through to vaccines are unsafe and should never be administered. It's also important to recognise that the reason people don't elect to have vaccines also covers a wide range of issues. These can be broadly split into 5 C's. Now, the first is confidence. It's so important that people feel safe in terms of the way the vaccine was tested and then the efficacy of the vaccine as well. There's also complacency, which is a perception of low risk and potentially low disease severity. Then there's convenience, which encompasses access issues, people dependent on their income and they can't really take time off work. And then there's communication, which is the sources of information. And lastly, the context, which is social demographic characteristics. All of these 5 C's together, when viewed in a personal context, have real validity. I mean, imagine that your nearest vaccine centre was 20 miles away and that you had no transport, or you were completely financially dependent on your job, you couldn't afford to take any time off, and you were worried about the post-vaccine symptoms. Those could be genuine concerns. Now, additionally, the development and rollout did happen very quickly, and that hard amount of data that came through was very complex and difficult to understand. All of these types of things can lead to vaccine hesitancy, and they need to be dealt with fairly and even-handedly without people being shouted at and made to feel bad. Now, on the flip side, we have a wealth of misinformation, mistrust and malfeasance, especially in the US. There has been, since the very start of the pandemic, moves to politicise, agendarise and weaponise the virus, and that has resulted in much misinformation being spread from so many different directions. Some of this misinformation has been created and spread by genuine misunderstanding, such as those in the Black and Hispanic communities. Now, historically, they have good reason not to trust the government health drives. Shameful episodes like the Tuskegee syphilis study and the ongoing racial inequalities mean that many simply just don't trust official government health channels. This type of mistrust isn't to be confused with the appalling behaviour of those who simply want to game the system to score political points, or simply refuse to objectively look at evidence because it doesn't fit in with their worldview or causes them some kind of cognitive dissonance. The real data and why I'm pro-vaccine. Now, you've been very patient up to this point while I line this up, so I am going to try to get to this without any more delay. The virus is real. It makes some people very sick. The statistics aren't perfect, but depending on your age, underlying health, the variant you catch, and the country you live in, your chance of dying is somewhere between 0.1 and 6%. Now, that's a huge gap. Many of the other factors that influence this, and we're only just starting to understand why some fit and healthy people die while those with multiple risk factors sail through without any ill effects. The only prudent course of action by world governments in the face of this kind of crazy variance in results is to seek a vaccination program. Vaccinations have a strong history from Edward Jenner through to the current day of helping create far better health outcomes. Now, there have been some exceptions to this, but by and large, they are effective. However, the results that they offer must be viewed at a societal level, using real-world data, not the lens of personal subjectivity. Yes, smallpox showed some signs of natural decline, but it was vaccination that led to a world without smallpox. Likewise, polio is now a rare disease in most parts of the world. Using direct personal anecdote stories like individuals who got sick after having a vaccine or children that suffered reactions after a vaccine does not carry the same weight as 150 to 200 million lives saved by the smallpox vaccine. I got the vaccine not because I was worried about myself, but because I was worried about others. That is not virtue signaling. It's genuinely true. It was one of the small ways I could help protect others, along with avoiding unnecessary contact and wearing a mask. The risk to me was vanishingly small. But I felt having a vaccine was part of my societal duty to try to resolve the issues for other people with the pandemic. Only time will tell what impact the COVID vaccine has had and will continue to have on the pandemic. Suffice to say, the vaccine has not caused an undue number of adverse side effects. It's caused some, for sure, and it's not without risks. But data from the latest wave of COVID that most countries are currently experiencing does show a reduced number of severely ill and dying people compared with the pre-vaccine spikes. Now, here is where I could produce a massive raft of data. Statistics on the number of infected, the hospitalizations, the deaths, the correlation of mask wearing versus spread, effectiveness of vaccines and spread versus various mutations that have appeared. But there's no point. And there is no point because it won't change your mind. If you're already pro-vaccine, then you'll simply nod and agree. If you're anti-vaccine or even a vaccine denier, then you'll just refuse to accept the statistics I offer. You'll cast doubt on any sources that I give you or the validity of the data that I offer you, WHO, CDC, NHS. It won't matter. You won't accept it. That's because your decision whether or not to have a vaccine wasn't based on data. It was based on emotion. Your political party, your friend group, or your church will have had far more bearing on your decision than any data I can give you. And this is the saddest part of the fractured and polarized society that we live in. We can't agree on anything, even when that agreement would help save lives. Maybe not your life, but the life of someone you don't know. If you can't trust the mainstream statistics on COVID, then please use your own ears and eyes. Don't rely on your friends and family, your favorite news channel on Facebook. Talk to people, talk to doctors, talk to nurses, talk to the people whose loved ones have died from COVID. Talk to virologists, talk to epidemiologists. Just please, try to keep an open mind on what they tell you. We would be really interested if you could tell us the reasons that you did or didn't get the vaccine. And please, if you've got time, leave a comment below telling us what your reasoning was. And if at the end of it all, you still don't want to have the vaccine, then your decision must be allowed. No one should ever have a vaccine forced on them. But your decision will not be consequence-free. That, however, is the subject for another video. Until then, keep safe and see you on the next Discourse Collective video. If you found this video useful, informative, enlightening, or even decision-changing, please do like and subscribe. It really helps the channel and it'll keep you up to date with what we produce.